Good morning. Good morning. Happy Sunday. Glad you guys are all here today. What do you think of this nice cool weather we're having? It's actually winter weather, right? The last couple of days, I felt like, what happened to our winter? What happened to our rain? We need more rain. So hopefully we'll get more rain soon. If not, we're all going to have to turn our sprinkler systems back on. So I'm glad you guys are all here today. I wanted to share some really exciting news with you. I've had so many people asking me, when are you guys going to go on your cruise? It's been 2 years. We booked it for September. So yay. Very excited about that. Thank you. I was a little motivated because they called and said, if you don't do it by the end of the year, you lose $875. So I was very motivated to get it done. So thank you for that. I'd like to share that with you because it was the church that gave this cruise to Ted and I as a gift when I had my 20th anniversary here at CrossWalk. So we're very excited about getting to do this. We're not going to do the extended one. We're going to do a little shorter one and then do some sightseeing in Victoria and Vancouver. So definitely excited for that, but looking forward to it. And we rented extra big rooms with extra big balconies just in case. So hopefully that's not going to be an issue. So I wanted to share with you, in the back, we have lots of books available. Open and Relational Theology is the one that Pete just taught on. A while back, he taught on God Can't, but we also have the God Can't book and the question and answer book back there available for you. And then also want to encourage you that on Wednesdays, we're doing the Heart of Christianity, and that's at 12 noon and at 7 p.m. At 12 noon, you can either do on Zoom or you can come and meet in person in Pete's office. Otherwise, at 7 o'clock at night, he's doing it on Zoom. So if you want to be part of that, just let us know, get us your email addresses so that we can get you included in the link. And then also, ladies, want to remind you that next week we're going to be doing Fuel Women's Ministry. And if it's nice enough weather, we'll probably meet out in the courtyard around the beautiful tables and under that beautiful, those 2 white trees. They were so full of white blossom petals. And I walked out the other day, it was like snow. They were just all coming off, which they usually only last a little while. So if you get a chance, go look at those beautiful white trees out there in the courtyard. And so I just want to remind you about that. And now I would like you to stand and greet each other. Pete, you're a little late. Go to the next slide. There you go. So Sunday, the 27th at 11:30. I'm going to be providing lunch for this, so you can just show up and enjoy some time of fellowship together with the other ladies. And we get to know each other on a whole different level than you do when you're sitting here in the worship center. So now I would like you to share with each other, when you think of colors that relate to boys and girls or men and women, what colors do you think of? Carrie said pink and blue. I understand this.
Green for boys, huh? Yeah.
You get that?
Yeah. So what do you think about life? How are you feeling on a scale of 1 to 2?
All right. Thanks for joining in the fun today. We've got a little different service for you. Normally we have the band playing, but I wanted to mix it up a little bit. Jennifer was going to be down in SoCal at Disneyland with her kids and thought, hey, this is an opportunity to just switch it up. So today is a little bit different. And one of those differences is we have several folks in our congregation that have integrated forms of meditation into their routine. And one of those is Keith Ridenauer, who's normally up here on sax, but today he's up here with the mic to lead us through a guided meditation. So come on up. Let's welcome Keith. Test.
It is. Okay, great. Okay. I started meditating in COVID when I had a whole lot of extra time, and I've started doing this for about during the entire time, so a couple of years now. I've been using a site called Waking Up by Sam Harris, and he has a variety of meditations which you use, but I really like this metta meditation, and metta is out of the Buddhist tradition, and it's loving kindness. So that's what the meditation is based on. So now, if you would, please sit in a way that you find comfortable, and please close your eyes. Become aware of the sensation of breathing. Try to follow each breath as closely as possible from the tip of your nose all the way down into your belly. And as you follow the breath, also notice what your visual field is like. Even though your eyes are closed, you still have a visual field in front of you that you can scan. Gaze into that darkness, which isn't quite dark. Let that space expand and notice the changes there. And as you gaze into that sky of the mind, visualize someone you know with whom you have a very uncomplicated relationship. Someone you love or admire, a friend or a family member. See if you can briefly call that person to mind with an image and wish them well. Actually think the thought, may you be happy. May you be free from suffering. May you realize all of your dreams. Actually connect with your wish for that person. You really do want them to be happy. Feel what that's like. You might call another person to mind. Again, an uncomplicated relationship. And form the same intention. May you be happy. May you be free from suffering, or whatever words that come to your mind. See if you can feel how much you want that for them. Now notice how even a subtle shift there changes your sense of what your mind is like. Now go back to feeling the next breath. And the next. And the next. And when you feel comfortable, open your eyes.
Psalm 37. I'm going to read you the first 11 verses. It's attributed to David. Don't worry about the wicked or envy those who do wrong. For like grass, they soon fade away. Like spring flowers, they soon wither. Trust in the Lord and do good. Then you will live safely in the land and prosper. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you your heart's desires. Commit everything you do to the Lord. Trust him, and he will help you. He will make your innocence radiate like the dawn, and the justice of your cause will shine like noonday sun. Be still in the presence of the Lord and wait patiently for him to act. Don't worry about evil people who prosper or fret about their wicked schemes. Stop being angry. Turn from your rage. Do not lose your temper. It only leads to harm. For the wicked will be destroyed, but those who trust in the Lord will possess the land. Soon the wicked will disappear. Though you look for them, they will be gone. The lowly will possess the land and will live in peace and prosperity. This meditation thing that we do is a way for us to be still before God. It is not owned by any particular religious tradition. It is actually shared among all religious traditions. And when Jesus went out into the wilderness after he was baptized, I'm very confident he spent a lot of time in silent reflection and meditation, because that's what you do when you're on that kind of a retreat. This particular passage that I just read to you is very peculiar because it ends saying that it's the lowly that will possess the land. This is resonating with the people of Israel who may have been in exile at times, come back and under a foreign oppressor, and felt very, very lowly. You know, Jesus would reiterate this sentiment years later, centuries later, saying, "Blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the kingdom of God." Could it be that there's something about when you are in that position of life, when you have absolutely nothing, that you are able to most see clearly what really, really matters? You know what I'm saying? You ever been in one of those moments where everything that really didn't matter faded away because of usually a crisis that happens in our life, or sometimes it's pure joy, like the birth of a baby, or you're in love for the first time, Or on the sad side, somebody you love deeply is struggling and may die or has died. When these kind of massive events happen, it's like our focus shifts and we realize that the things that we fret about most of the time really aren't that worth it. And at the end of the day, the most important things are those things that we all long for. Love for ourselves, for other people, peace for ourselves, for other people. This is what the psalmist is getting at. Today, going to shift a little bit, and I've got a couple interesting pieces for you. This is going to be related to what we're going to hear Jesus talking about in Scripture in a bit. I'm going to make your head work a little bit today, so hope you brought some Advil. And first thing I wanted to recognize, and today was a day to do this because the lack of our band, but you know, we've been talking about Black History Month here throughout this month because that's what February is. I've been introducing you to different characters in history that are really phenomenal and their achievement and what they've brought into the world. And today I've got one for you as well. But I first wanted to just kind of lay some groundwork with you with a song, not from me, but I'm going to play it for you in a second. And it's a surprisingly controversial song. In fact, this song was performed before a football game, I think this past season. It may have been one of the opening games. I can't remember. But it was a song that was offered before the national anthem was sung. Kind of like the Super Bowl, you know, we do God Bless America, some artist does that, and then we do the national anthem. It was kind of like that, but it was a different song. And depending on which airwaves you were listening to, some viewed this as an incredibly unpatriotic thing to do. To sing this particular song or have this song performed at a football game before the national anthem would be played. And so as I was poking around a little bit, I found this song being performed by none other than the U.S. Army Field Band. Have you ever heard any of our armed forces bands play or choirs sing? They are incredible. I mean, they're cream of the crop artists from around the nation. When my son was deep into trombone and showing signs of possibility, he was being asked by his director to consider going into like the Air Force band because it was just such a great experience and travel and exposure and all that. And these musicians are incredible. Luckily, we're close to a base. So if you ever get the chance to hear the Air Force Jazz Band that tours around, it's usually a free concert, incredible. But I found it interesting that the U.S. Army Field Band chose to represent chose to offer this particular song, which to me communicates that perhaps this song itself is deeply patriotic, even if foreign to most of us. So this song has often been called the Black National Anthem. Let every voice rise and sing. I think I got that right. So Dar, hit it and it should go on its own. Enjoy.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on to victory. Is one.
Don't know if you're able to read that. The print's a little small, but it was in honor of all the African-American soldiers who have fought in every war since the Revolutionary War in the United States, and honoring their service to our country, So today we're going to take another little musical journey in just a moment. Again, just about a 5-minute thing where you'll be able to read things on the screen that are important about our history and about what has brought us to now. And then some hopeful stuff, because as you'll see once you get through to about the last screen, when I think of Black History Month, I have a tension. One is I'm reminded of where we've been and things that we can't feel good about. And there's not enough lipstick to make that pig pretty. You know what I mean? And yet there are some realities that are incredibly inspiring that come from Black America specifically, that are worthy of lifting up and recognizing, that we'll get to in a moment. So sit back, relax. You've got some reading to do, so there's going to be a lot on the screens for you to read. I think you'll be able to read it. And two beautiful songs. One comes from the slave tradition itself, which you'll recognize, and the other you may be able to pick up. It's a fanfare on a well-known hymn. So let's do it, Darn. Enjoyed that little journey through American history and particularly related to African Americans here. And Dar, there you go. Thanks for advancing to that. So I asked you a weird question a little bit earlier today, and that was when you think about colors that are associated with boys or girls or men and women, what comes to mind? So anybody have a thought on that? Pink and blue, right? This is what we think of, right? I mean, even when you have birth announcements, it's a girl, it's a boy, whatever's going to be in the room or whichever you're sending out to friends. If it's a boy, it's going to be filled with blue stuff. If it's a girl, it's going to be pink. Am I right? Of course. However, that's only true now. About 100 years ago or more, that was not the case. In fact, it was reversed. Can you believe it? That about 100 and some years ago, late 1800s, pink was actually a masculine color. It was a sign of strength. If men wore pink, it meant you were strong. And you know what color made you look wimpy and effeminate? Blue. Isn't that crazy? It's just a reminder that time changes and the way we see things now is not necessarily the way it has always been. We're going to look at some biblical stuff today, some words of Jesus specifically, and the way that we approach the language and the teaching that we're going to see in Jesus. We look at it a particular way because of the voices that have shaped our vision of it. So very brief history. For the first 300 years or so of Christianity, to be Christian was to be weak. It was to be running for your lives. It was to be done in hiding because it was seen as a dangerous cult. Judaism has kicked it out already, and so there's hardly any Jewish Christians left 3 centuries into the whole tradition. And Rome isn't particularly happy with it either because it goes against the grain of Roman mythology and the emperor itself, because Christianity was claiming that the emperor was not God. And that drove them into the catacombs to worship. But then, almost overnight, Christianity became the official religion of the superpower, the Roman Empire under Constantine. It went from absolute powerlessness, where you could be harmed if not killed for being a Christian, to now all of a sudden you could be harmed or killed if you weren't a Christian. And that changed the way we thought about the faith. Fast forward centuries and centuries to about 300-400 years ago, 500 years ago even. And now you have some of the commentators who are still informing the way the church thinks about its faith and how it interprets its scriptures. And they're writing from now a place of Protestantism, but also power, coming at the whole text from a position of strength. But that's not how most of the Bible was written. And that's not how Jesus entered the world. Jesus, like every person that he really had interaction with in a meaningful way, was very poor. He lived in an oppressed land that was ruled by the Roman Empire. Nobody in anybody's memory had any recollection of them actually owning and having power over their own land in the time of Jesus. It had been centuries, really, before that had happened. When Jesus spoke, he offered hope because God was clearly at work through him, a very poor man. And that in itself turned the tables around so that every one of us, and if we were in ancient Israel, we all would represent the 99.9% of people that are our neighbors. And we're all in the same poor boat together. And we feel powerless, and we hear the voices of those literally above us saying, well, God clearly favors us because of our power and our position, and clearly doesn't think much of you. When Jesus starts coming around and shows healing and grace to people who are poor just like him, and it was obvious that God was with them, people got the message and they believed it, that God actually cares even for the poor, even for the powerless. And so we're going to see some examples of that coming up. But what is hopeful to me in thinking about Black history this month, and I've been on my own little evolutionary journey through this, and being introduced to different characters that I didn't know anything about, but that have truly impacted my life and have impacted your life as well. To me, that's very inspiring, that even though the origins of Black history in America were absolutely horrific, and there's still remnants of it that are with us today, causing continual, perpetual problems, even though that's the case, there are characters that were resilient and strong and brilliant and brought things into the world from a position that you could never, ever imagine. And certainly in their origin story, you wouldn't. So today I offer you Lewis Latimer, born 1848, died in 1928. His parents escaped slavery, as I recall, from Virginia and went right into some northern states where they could be free. And they lived around there for a while until some interstate slave traders recognized who he was and had him arrested, tried to get him back to his slave owner. Now, it became a court case because now he's in a free state. So should he be treated like a slave? None other than Franklin Douglas came to his defense and tried to make the case to the judge, and they got him off. He didn't have to serve much time, and all he had to do was pay a fine, which they helped with. Pretty amazing. So they're going on about their lives, and then this case called Dred Scott, which a lot of us may not be as familiar with, but Dred Scott was a case that challenged the idea that if you're a slave in one state, then you're all of a sudden, if you're in another state, you're not free. It happened like this. There was a slave and a slave owner that moved traveled from Missouri to Wisconsin, which was a free state. And then they went back to Missouri. The slave sued his slave owner because since he went to Wisconsin where slavery didn't exist, he must have been freed. Therefore, he thought, I have a case to make that I should be free even though I'm back in Missouri. And the case came out like this, where your freedom depended on the state where you started. So the states that were slavery abiding and holding and upholding, if you were from that state, that's the law that you were under. It didn't matter that you went to another state. When Dred Scott came down, Lewis Latimer's father had to make a very difficult decision, knowing that it was a very good chance that he was going to be arrested soon, especially with his profile, and that he'd be taken back. And so to protect his family, he left his family. So now you've got a broken family because of a broken system that's happening in our country. And yet, this Lewis Latimer, he was able to get an apprenticeship in different areas of industry and soon began to find out that he had his own gifts and his own brain power to offer to the table. Every summer, I bet a strong number of you turn on an air conditioner in your home. And those 2 weeks where it's actually hot in Napa, usually in November, right? Did you know that one of the very first air conditioners was patented by Lewis Latimer, an evaporator air conditioner? Some of us might call this a swamp cooler. But he learned through his study in physics that a swamp cooler could actually be very efficient and effective at bringing down the temperature in a room. That's him. Some other things that he brought. If you've ever gone to the bathroom on a moving train, first of all, that's a real bummer. Sorry that you had to experience that. But if you did, you can thank him a little bit that it wasn't worse, because back in that day when rail was pretty much what you had, it must have been a horrific experience. And he improved it and patented the improvement coming from him, an African-American. You've probably heard of Thomas Edison, but you probably haven't heard of some of his rivals. This guy worked for one of his rivals and helped figure out how to mass produce light bulbs. Now in California, you can't buy incandescent bulbs except for very specific circumstances and very specific bulbs. You can't get them anymore, so we're not as familiar with them. But there's a carbon filament that's a part of an incandescent bulb. Lewis Latimer figured out how to mass produce that so that they wouldn't break in the process, and light bulbs became possible for the multitude. Knowing that his company wanted to take home electricity and home lighting to the rest of the world, Lewis Latimer literally wrote the book on how to employ electric lighting in a household and how to mass produce light bulbs. Any of you have a table lamp or a floor lamp in your home? You can thank him, because the first patent for a table lamp was from Lewis Latimer. Fascinating. This kind of history come from that kind of a place. The reason I like these stories is because it kind of makes a point for us that if given the right environment, if given the right tools, people, even from the horrific background of slavery, can succeed and do well. There are some today, because of all the things that have happened to shape our history, there are still some people today that believe that African Americans are an inferior race of people. I'm not kidding. It's hard to get it out of them. They're generally not going to say it in parts where they don't feel comfortable saying it. And yet I've heard it in this community. And so I know that that idea exists. And yet we have these Lewis Latimers and many more like him that completely go against that. That if given the same opportunity, or even a close to the same opportunity, they rise, because we're all human beings and one race is not inferior to another. So inspiring to me. Yep, we've got this tension of there are some awful things, but yes, we have these examples of resilience and possibility and hope and strength that if we can feed, will just help eradicate more and more the inequality and inequity that we have in our country and is still with us. So that gets us to the story today about Jesus and what he has to say. Because when we think about Jesus, we naturally see ourselves. A lot of the churches that we've grown up in, the picture of Jesus that we had was a white dude from Sweden. He even had blue eyes. That's the picture that is pretty famous. And that's not what Jesus looked like. Jesus was a Mediterranean man, and he looked the part. And he was from a region that was oppressed by the Roman Empire. He lived in oppression, and he had something to say to his friends who also lived in oppression. And his words, at first glance, they don't seem particularly challenging. They seem a little odd, some of them, but they don't particularly unsettle us. So let's just take a look at it and let's see what you think. So Jesus says, "You have heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you're sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow." And the next passage says, "You've heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you'll be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. For he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike." Now, one quick word of note here. He starts both of these passages saying, "You have heard the law that says," and then he follows it up with a, "but I tell you." This tells us that Jesus is challenging the way that things were thought and addressed, an interpretation of the law. Jesus is changing, giving a new interpretation of the law that most people were very familiar with. He's mixing it up. He has a new take on things. More on this loving your enemies stuff. He goes on and says, "If you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. If you are kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. But you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." All of you Enneagram 1s who are bent on perfection, you just sigh when you hear Jesus say that. I knew it all along, and I'm so far from perfection. What am I going to do? Well, good news for you, there's a different word that we need to look at that is actually more appropriate than that word perfect. You know, when we read these things of Jesus, they're pretty familiar to us. Turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. We get that, be generous, love your enemies. It all sounds very nice. And when we read it, my hunch is that for the most of us, in case you've forgotten me teaching on this in previous years, which is why I'm bringing it up again, and we'll bring it up again and again and again, is when we hear this, it just seems like Jesus is saying, hey, be a nice person. That's kind of what I'm telling you to do. Be a nice person. And of course, we should be nice people. But could it be that because of who was reading and studying these passages, that something was missed? Could it be that if the people who were offering commentary on these passages were from a place of power when they wrote it, is it possible that they missed some things that were present in the text that were coming from a position of oppression? Could it be that when you enter this from a place of oppression, you understand what Jesus is saying differently than you would if you read this from a position of power? The commentators that we've had for the last 500 years and more have written from a place of power. And some fairly recent scholarship within the last 100 years or less, really, have done some important homework to help us understand what these phrases of Jesus meant from a position of oppression, what he was saying, really, and what was being understood by the audience. And it is a direct hit about Black History Month in our country. So I just want to walk through these with you. So on the next slide, we're just going to knock these out one by one and help you understand what's going on. The first thing that we see here, I'm saying that Jesus was a nonviolent resistant leader because he was. Now, I need to understand that in and of itself made him fairly different, because most of the people who claimed to be Messiah in the first century in ancient Israel, they were planning to lead a revolt of violence. It's the only way they could think to beat Rome. They thought, if there are just enough of us that gather our pitchforks and God gets behind us, we're going to be able to take out the Roman Empire. We just know it. We just need God to do it all over again like he did in Egypt. That was the great hope. Who will be faithful enough to pick up your pitchfork and go for it? Violent revolt was the only game in town. That was the only message being said. But Jesus knew that would not work. He knew that every time a peasant would pick up a pitchfork, a Roman soldier would pick up the sword. Every time an Israelite would rise up, they would immediately be squashed like bugs by the Roman Empire, who were the military superpower in the world at that time. One of the last uprisings that happened was in the 60s AD, not the 1960s, the 60s. And it was after Jesus had died, 30 years after that. The new church was kind of making its way around. Some of the New Testament writings had come online, somewhat being circulated. The stories certainly were. And there was an uprising. And some Jewish people took the city of Jerusalem, the capital city, which was a walled city. And they thought, okay, this is the beginning. We just got to wait for God to make things happen. And there were springs that fed, underground springs that fed Jerusalem, so they could hang in there for a while. They had fresh water and supplies for a while. But the Roman government knew that it was just a matter of time before they started running out of food. And so the Roman Empire surrounded the city of Jerusalem and waited and waited and waited and waited, until the people inside the walls started to starve. At that point, the Jewish men inside the walls asked for a deal. It's not appropriate for the women and children to suffer and die under this. You have no qualm with them, so let us let them out, and this will be between us menfolk and you Roman Empire soldiers. Okay, so Rome agreed. Why should we let the women and children suffer? So they opened the gate. The women and children went out as the husbands and fathers peered over the wall to watch to make sure that this transaction happened. The Roman Empire immediately, in front of those men, fathers, husbands, slaughtered the women and the children on the field in front of the city wall, and then proceeded to go into the city and wipe out every one of those Jewish men and destroy the temple of Jerusalem itself, and it has not been rebuilt since. You rise up against the superpower, you will be squashed like a bug. I just want to point out something really obvious, that all of us love our country. Our country has the greatest military might the world has ever seen. We have the greatest equipment. We have the largest military force of anywhere. When you and I think, we think from a position of superpower. That's our orientation. If you've ever traveled internationally, you travel with some confidence with your US passport because you know it carries the full weight of the country who has endorsed you. I know I've felt that. Gone into, somewhat dangerous countries that our own country says you probably shouldn't go there, like Kenya, and actually like Tijuana, Mexico. But I also knew that there was relative safety because a country doesn't want anything to happen to an American because they know what could happen to them if something terrible goes wrong. History certainly shows that. So we need to be honest with ourselves that first, when we read about this, when we hear about this, you and I have a tough time relating to the audience of Jesus and to Jesus himself. Just be aware of it. And we're talking about the opposite side here, of people who knew that they were under a superpower that was not caring for them. So Jesus, knowing that they were in the presence of a superpower that could not be beaten in a revolutionary, normal manner with violence, he's offering a different take here. And he starts off with this eye for an eye stuff. The eye for an eye is deeply biblical. It's in the Old Testament. And basically what it says is this. If Lauren punches me in the eye and blinds my eye, there's going to be justice served. And the justice says, and I'm going to get the equivalent of an eye out of him, maybe even his eye. So I get to punch him in the eye, perhaps. Or maybe we'll figure out a dollar amount for how much my eyesight was worth in that one eye, and he has to give me 2 donkeys and a couple of chickens, and we'll call it good. So maybe that's it. So it kind of makes sure that there's equality in justice, but then it also does something else. It makes sure that you don't go beyond that. So it's not an eye for 3 eyes. It's not an eye for 4 eyes. It's not like under the law, I could go to him and say, well, you just took my eye out, so I'm going to take your eye, and I'm going to take 3 donkeys and 4 chickens. The law would not allow for that. That's what the eye for an eye thing is all about, equal justice under the law. And Jesus is saying, you can't think that way as people who are oppressed under an oppressor, because that kind of justice is not going to be afforded for you because they don't care about you. They're not worried about your justice, those who are in power, because their world is fine. And so he's interchanging, he's teaching stuff to the disciples about how do you interact? How do you do something to cause change when this is the case? So I'm going to need Lauren's help, if you wouldn't mind coming up on stage, Lauren. All right. As you can see, he is wearing protective gear, so he's going to be safe today, everybody. Come on up on stage. And let's see here. Let's have you stand right there and face me. All right. So in the olden days, in Jesus' day, if I were to come up and I was to punch Lauren right in the nose, he could take me to court and he could sue me for X amount of dollars because of that great offense. However, if Lauren, being an equal to me, we're equal in our stature and the size of society and all that, we're both menfolk. If I, on the other hand, would have chosen to backslap him on his right cheek, he could sue me for twice as much, even though it didn't hurt half as much. You know why? Because this is an act of an aggressor over a subordinate. This is something you do to a slave or a servant or a child or a wife. People who are under the authority of another. For me to do this to an equal was deeply offensive in that culture. He could be sued for twice as much. Isn't that fascinating? So what does Jesus suggest you do? So I hit you like this. Jesus says, offer the left cheek as well. Now we look at this as the sign of passivity, like, oh, don't get in a fight. That's not what Jesus is saying at all. If Lauren comes back and shows me his left cheek, so turn your face just a little bit, I can't backslap him anymore. If I'm going to do any more, I'm going to have to use my fist. And if I'm using my fist against him, I am saying with my fist, he is an equal. He is not a subordinate. You see? This is this crazy, subtle subordination thing of challenging the positions that were there in that ancient culture without increasing the violence. The offender doesn't want to hit him with a fist now, even though he really kind of does. But he knows he doesn't want to because of what message that would send about their status together. Isn't that fascinating? Turn the other cheek is not to be passive. Turn the other cheek is treat me as an equal because we are. Fascinating. Thank you, Lord. Good job. All right. Excellent work. Well, I could have Lauren help me with this one. If they asked for your shirt, give them your coat. We could have Lauren standing naked before you today, but I will not ask such things of this crosswalker at this moment. Here's what's going on with give them your shirt and your coat. So remember, we're talking about extremely poor people. And the shirt that we're talking about that a person could be sued for, the context is a person who that's their only piece of clothing other than their coat. Now, in ancient law and the way in Jesus' culture, you couldn't take somebody's coat, at least for overnight. If somebody owed you a significant amount of money, you could hold on to their coat so they could go work for the day in their shirt, their one and only shirt. But at nighttime, you had to return their coat to them. That was the law because they recognized that if they didn't have a coat, they would die from exposure. So what we have here is a very, very poor person who probably found themselves indebted to whoever has the note for them, and they're unable to make their payment. And so the person who probably doesn't really need their money, but wants to make the point, is taking him to court so he can get this one tunic, this one shirt, that what is he going to do with anyway? His only purpose in taking this guy to court is to humiliate the poor person further. There's no other real benefit being gained here, other than to humiliate the person who is being sued. So what does Jesus say? Does he says to take up arms, draw your sword? No. He says, if you're forced to do that in court, go ahead and give him your shirt and then fully disrobe. Because in that day and age, when you fully disrobe, you have created an immense amount of embarrassment for the entire court and especially shamed the one who is suing you, because how dare they sue you for the one and only shirt that you have? A non-violent way to shine a light on the injustice that was taking place in the courtroom itself. It's fascinating. When we get to this go the extra mile, that's even a tagline for a gas station. You ever seen that? Bought a cup of soda or whatever, and right on their cups, all their cups, go the extra mile or just the extra mile. And we take this to mean, oh, well, the thing to do is to, be a nice person, go the extra mile. If a soldier wants you to carry his stuff, well, just go the extra mile because you're such a nice person. That's what Jesus must be talking about. Well, no, he's not. By law, Roman soldiers could enforce any Jewish person to carry their pack, their heavy pack, for 1 mile and not one step further. There was no way around that. There was no resisting that. So Jesus does not suggest to put up a fight when he's wanting to throw his pack on you. Jesus is saying something else. He's saying, okay, go ahead and take the pack for that first mile. And when you get to the end of the first mile, keep carrying the pack for another mile or more. And the reason Jesus wants and suggests this is because he knows that eventually they're going to run into a commanding officer. And the commanding officer is going to see this guy and just check in. How long have you been carrying this guy's pack? Or maybe the Jewish person themselves says, hey, I thought the law was that we're only supposed to carry for 1 mile. I've been carrying this thing for 2-3 miles now. Immediately the power is shifted. And this bully, the Roman soldier who forced you to carry their pack, now has to answer to authority himself. And he is in an awkward position. It is a turning the tables on the problem. It is bringing a light onto the injustice that was pushed on the people of oppression. Does that make sense? Not being a nice guy, shining a light on what needs to be challenged. When he talks about give to those in need with generosity, he's realizing that the people who have money are dealing with extremely poor people. And just asking them, if you have something, if you have food to eat, share it with people who don't have food to eat. And don't charge them interest on it because they can't pay it. Have compassion on the people that are around you that need help and just do it. That's easy enough. Love your enemies. This actually was quite bold and was counterintuitive. It was not the way Jewish people used to think. In fact, if you do some study on the culture that Jesus lived in, the prevailing view of love your enemies was love your enemies if they're Jewish. But if they're not Jewish, don't love them, because that's a different category of enemy altogether. When Jesus uses this phrase, loving your enemies, he's not talking about just fellow Jewish people. He's talking about all people. That's the context that Jesus is talking about, and that's why it was revolutionary. Now, why is he saying that? Because the peace that Jesus is after is not a temporary peace that is brought about by force, but Jesus is after a depth of peace called shalom, which is where real peace happens. You know, we see this kind of dynamic, the differences between kinds of peace and a very small scale and very large scales. We see it happen in relationships between friends or lovers. Conflict happens, and sometimes one of the partners, that can be male or female really, will raise their voice, raise themselves in authority over the other to intimidate the other one to be quiet. And the lesson learned for the one who chose to sit with that is don't raise your voice again, don't challenge again, or you're going to get more where that came from. You're going to get yelled at, you're going to get mean things said, all of that. That happens all the time. Now, in a sense, peace has been created because there's no more fighting, because the person who just got yelled at decided, okay, this is not worth it anymore. And the person who is feeling uncomfortable has also learned, don't bring it up anymore, because you're walking on eggshells, and that's okay, because it's better than the alternative. That happens all the time. In other situations in peace, we understand this was how Rome said, we come in peace. That was their thing. But the peace of Rome came with a really, really, really big military presence. A really, really, really big military presence will keep people down, but it will not create peace. It will keep conflict down, but it will not treat the undercurrents that bring the conflict to bear. Jesus understands that if true peace is going to happen, it requires a heart change. It requires a vision change for how we even see people. And so long as we see the other as different, as less than, unworthy of respect or love, we will treat them accordingly. This actually is a strategy that's been employed in horrific ways. In Nazi Germany, the way they got away with eradicating millions of Jewish people is they started the campaign, the propaganda campaign, saying Jewish people are not to be trusted. They are less than human. They're certainly less than German. And because they had enough people buy into the propaganda, the lie that was true, it became easier and easier for everybody to be okay with just dismissing the world of these horrible, horrible people who are really less than human. And so they were able to take human beings and do horrific things to them and kill them, and that's called the Holocaust. It was a strategy. In the United States, we did the same thing, and not just in the United States. This is happening in Europe, and then definitely made it to the United States, where when it came to African people, we looked at them as less than human. This was part of the rhetoric. It's part of the theology that helped us do this in the first place. And it wasn't just in America. It was happening all over Europe. You can read all about that in some articles that I've kicked out to you. But this thing was the reality there. But what happens when we do that? When we say that the other person is not quite human, it gives us the right to treat them in inhuman ways, and we do. Crazy thing happened in the United States during World War II. We had several POW camps for Germans in the United States. There was one in South Dakota. There were some in the Deep South. And these German POWs who were on American soil, they enjoyed relative freedom. There are even stories about how they would be let out of their camp and go help with people's gardening. They would teach in schools. They eventually assimilated into our own culture. Up in South Dakota, as I recall, in this particular camp, they even had quite a quite a cultural scene. And so musical instruments and artistic stuff was purchased for the prisoners to put on concerts for the surrounding communities. I mean, I hear this stuff, I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. But it's true. That really happened here. Now, meanwhile, Japanese United States citizens 80 years ago were interred, were taken from their homes as U.S. citizens and taken out in the middle of nowhere where they had to wait it out in abject poverty while they were there. Why? Why the difference? Why do we treat one group who have citizenship in the United States and we cart them away, and yet another group, which are clearly enemies, or fighting against us, we bring them over and treat them so well? Well, it's because one of them looked like the majority of Americans and one of them did not. When we distinguish as other, we very easily go to the next place of treating them like other, and often in very inhuman ways. Jesus was being as profound then as he is today. What does it mean for us to dehumanize someone? And if we dehumanize anyone, what does that really mean about God for us? If God decides by our calculations who is worthy of love, and who the heck are we to suggest that we are the ones who should be the special recipients of the favor and love of God over someone else? This is why Jesus' word was so penetrating for his original audience. He's saying, no, if you really believe the love of God is the love of God for every single human being on this planet, how does that play out for you? How are you seeing with eyes of love? The final thing here, really, we need to get rid of the word perfect, because he said, be perfect like your heavenly Father is perfect. This original language, it comes from the Greek word and can be translated in multiple ways. Remember, the Bible is not written in English. And this particular word Paul uses in some of his letters, uses it multiple times. But the word Paul uses when he uses the same root Greek word is mature. And that's probably a better word for this particular passage. So Jesus is not saying you must be perfect, which is absolutely impossible, but he can say to us, grow up, become mature in who you are as a human being walking with God. When I see all these things, I see a very different picture of Jesus, one that I would never have thought about because of my position in life and who I am and how I've been raised. I've been in middle class my entire life. I've been mostly around people who look like me my entire life, with a few exceptions here and there. That's my worldview. That's the worldview of my family. They wouldn't know otherwise. They wouldn't know to ask certain questions. They wouldn't know to notice certain things because it hasn't affected us. And so when we see other people groups that seem to be struggling or seem to be causing problems, we just kind of wonder, what is wrong with them? And rather than get to a blaming kind of a state, maybe people like me need to ask more questions like, what are the undercurrents? What are the things that exist that are still with us that maybe need to be looked at? Because as I see Jesus, as I read him, he's saying, these are things that we need to do to say, there's a problem here that we need to understand more fully. And I got a great example of this from my own family history. My dad was a pastor, and the churches that we grew up in, that I grew up in, weren't terribly diverse. We had some Laotian refugees in our Prairie Village, Kansas, suburb of Kansas City, church that we helped bring over, and that was about as much diversity as there. Wasn't much more than that. I had some Asian Americans there. They were good friends. But I asked my dad about his previous church before that, which was in Topeka, Kansas. Topeka, Kansas is where Brown versus the Board of Education went down. And that ruling actually is complicated. Trying to do a good thing messed up another thing. But I was wondering from my dad, who was a pastor there in the mid-60s, I wondered, hey, what was it like being a pastor in Topeka, Kansas, in the middle of the civil rights movement, in the epicenter of a major court ruling? And my dad said, which is, I'm not slighting him in the least, I'm just using this as an example to prove my point. He said, I didn't really hear much about it. So I hear that, and the church really didn't talk about it all that much. Why? Because they were white. Because it didn't affect them. They weren't really thinking about it. wasn't their problem. I wonder if we can hear Jesus as one who is speaking from a very different perspective. Now, the next slide, and I know this is uncomfortable stuff. I don't really like teaching about it, even though I think I need to, because this is what Jesus is saying to us. But Jesus' instruction was to be actively engaged in shining a light on injustice and nonviolent ways. And so I asked some questions. What does this mean for people of faith following in Jesus' footsteps? What injustices are we aware of? And what injustices are we willfully ignorant about, that we just don't really care or don't really want to know? And what are we doing to foster change? We need to shine a light on stuff. One of the most painful lights to shine is on ourselves. The church has this reputation that is slowly eroding of a place where you don't show your true colors. That used to be the thing. You dress up super nice to hide the pain and the struggle that you were going through and to honor God. I get that. But the church was the last place where you would be vulnerable. Church was a place where you had to put on your Sunday face and make the best of it. That's starting to change. It's starting to change, but not fast enough. Because as long as we tell ourselves there's no problem here, problems aren't going to get fixed. Problems aren't going to get addressed in here, let alone anywhere else. Jesus is a radical teacher. A radical teacher. Do we have eyes to see? Lewis Latimer is the guy who invented the household lamp to shine a light for us to see easier. Isn't it ironic that the one who gave us the light in our homes is the one who may be less welcome in our homes, is the one whose light we don't really want to see shining in different things and complex problems? I don't want to make you uncomfortable, even though I know this is very uncomfortable. I take no joy in that, but I hope beyond the uncomfortability, I hope you'll ask some questions like, man, what do I do with this Jesus who is speaking from a different perspective and who's challenging us to think in different ways? What do we do with that? And what does it mean if we claim to follow him? So with that, let's pray together. So just ask for you to be still for a moment. And God, I'm asking that your Spirit just help us identify one or two takeaways from today, even if that takeaway is, I kind of hate Pastor Pete right now. That's okay. Even if that takeaway is, I kind of hate this subject. Or maybe it's a particular thing that Jesus taught about. I don't know. But God, I'm just asking you to help us just to identify one or two. And Spirit of God, I'm asking you to help us some more by helping us wonder, why did those one or two things pop up? What is it about being angry with Pastor Pete, or angry with the subject, or frustrated or questioning about this particular passage or whatever? Why is that a thing that has popped up today? Just give us a hint, God. And finally, Spirit of God, who knows us so well, where there is no corner of darkness in our lives, who loves us anyway. Spirit of God, what are you calling us to do today in response to what our takeaways are? I don't know what that nudge would be, but I know to a person, God, that what that nudge is very specific to us. And I pray, God, that we will have the courage and the faith in you enough, you who love us, to move forward with you. To that end, we repeat this prayer and say together, be on the screen, you can open your eyes, a rendition of the Lord's Prayer, crafted by Jim Cotter. Let's say it out loud together. Eternal Spirit, earth maker, pain bearer, life giver, source of all this is and that shall be, Father and Mother of us all, loving God in whom is heaven. The hallowing of your name echo through the universe. The way of your justice be followed by peoples of the world. Your heavenly will be done by all created beings. Your commonwealth of peace and freedom sustain our hope and come on earth. With the bread we need for today, feed us. In the hurts we absorb from one another, forgive us. In times of temptation and test, strengthen us. From trials too great to endure, spare us. From the grip of all that is evil, free us. For you reign in the glory of the power that is love, now and forever. Amen. If you're in a particular studious mood, the academic work behind this stuff that I've given you today is in my blog. I actually give you the source from a guy who wrote a book talk about, it's called If Jesus is Lord. And he gives you the footnotes for the academic scholars that provide all this information, which I shared for you today. It's a 13-page blog post, so I hope you enjoy that. If you have trouble sleeping, it's there for you. But the scholarship and the academics is legit, and I hope it's helpful. All right, thanks for coming. See you next week.